Well, I'm a pretty sequential person, and you can kind of see this in my sermon topics. I gave earlier this year, a sermon on 1 Samuel, and the next one was on 2 Samuel. And then I gave one on Paul, and then the next one was more Paul. Last sermon was Paul and the law. And it turned out that was a pretty enormous topic. And it turned out to be a little long sermon. And I focused on Romans and Galatians in that sermon. And in those two epistles, the Greek word law, nomos, occurred 107 times. More than all the books of the New Testament combined. 3 times more than all the Gospels combined. So it was a lot of material to cover. And this caused me to really narrow my focus to truly be on Paul and his perspective. So today, I'm going to do the same subject, different spin, maybe a little bit easier. The title of my message today is Jesus and the Law. So with Paul, he focused a lot on justification, faith, and righteousness. But today with Jesus, I'm going to focus on the law's boundaries, its enforcement, and its purpose. So Paul and Jesus, what they say align pretty closely, but their focuses are a little different. So for those of you that have heard the previous message, I'm hoping you still get a lot out of this one. For those that didn't, it's still an independent topic. I hope both of you get something out of it. So I'd like to start first about explaining the boundaries of the law. After that last sermon, I was asked the question, if there were different uses of the law that Paul could have been using. Could have he been talking about the written law, or could have he been talking about the oral law, or the pre-Talmudic law? It is clear there are different uses of the word law. But the Greek word, nomos, accounts for 90% of what's translated as law in the New Testament. And going back to what I said about Romans and Galatians, 104 and out of 107 of the occurrences of law were nomos. So looking at the word itself, you can't distinguish between whether it's written law or oral law. You have to look at the context. And you can see in much of the context of Paul, he's clearly referring to the written law. But he also equates the word law to physical adherence. He does that quite often. And when he does this, there's a good case that can be made that he's not necessarily referring directly to the written law, but he's referring to how people were using the law. So today I want to kind of start by kind of laying things out by going through the different types of law. And I broke it out into 4 different categories. And they're all relevant to Jesus' discussion of the law. So the first one is the written law. This is the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It's often called the Torah because that's what it is in Hebrew. And this written law contains stories, but it also contains a lot of laws that the Israelites were expected to live by. And even with the written law, there are different ways to parse it. There's subcategories of the written law. There are physical laws that are enforceable, like do not eat the blood of animals. And there are spiritual laws in the written law as well. And those spiritual laws are inherently not enforceable, like love God. There are natural laws, laws intended for all of mankind, for all times. Do not murder. And then there are civil laws, laws for the civil government of Israel. An example would be the laws of the cities of refuge. They just aren't applicable today, but they were applicable in Israel's society. They aren't applicable physically. You could probably get some spiritual applicability to them. But the references, there are different tells within Scripture that tells you that this is definitely referring to the written law. For example, if you use the law in conjunction with the prophets, like the law and the prophets, almost always it's referring to the written law. Another tell is the use of the word Moses, like the law of Moses or Moses' law. And sometimes they just leave out law entirely and just say Moses and the prophets. Almost 25% of the New Testament uses of the word nomos actually have the word Moses or prophets in the same verse. So these are really good tells. This is the written law, and it's a good sign that many of the laws referred throughout the New Testament really are referring to the written law. So number 2, different category of law. There is the interpreted law. And this is man's attempt to understand and apply God's law. And the oral law or the Talmud, these would fit into this category. And sometimes this category of law can have a negative connotation to it. Because after all, man has a special ability to botch God's law. But each church, including our own, interprets Scripture, interprets what the law is, what we should be doing. Our doctrines are interpretive. And these can be derived from the written law, the prophets and the writings, and from the teachings of Jesus Christ and his apostles. But each individual can also have their own stances on what is right and what is wrong. There's different situations. It may not be clearly laid out in Scripture. Everybody's not going to come to the same conclusions. And as I said earlier, Paul's law, in some cases, may have been referring more to this interpretive law. And in the Gospel of John with Jesus, and I'm not going to cover this as much, but you see lots of him using the phrase "your law," so that's probably a good indication that he's referring kind of their interpretation of the law. So the third law category, the civil law. These are rules attempting to maintain and organize a just society. And the written law, as I covered earlier, was intended to serve as the basis for ancient Israel's civil law. And Israel didn't really do a good job at doing this or keeping this or enforcing this, but that was the intent. By Jesus, the Romans had controlled Israel. But the Jews still had some say in the local laws. And we can see this in Scripture. Jesus was condemned for blasphemy. We can see this in the stoning of Stephen and in the stoning of Paul. This was done because they were breaking the Jews' interpretation of God's law, and those were enforced locally. In America, we have this separation between church and state, and that was a major aspect of the founding of America. So we really aren't exposed to these religious-based laws, civil laws. But we can see in Scripture there are pros and there are cons to man's attempt at applying God's law into society. And most of the words nomos I don't think apply to the civil laws at all, but we will discuss the civil law because it plays in to Jesus' teachings and his discussion. The fourth category of law, fourth and last category, God's law. This is true righteousness. And it is the law by which sin is measured. When someone sins, they are breaking God's law. And the written law does not wholly define the boundaries of God's law. You can rigidly keep the written law and still sin. And you can see the Pharisees as a prime example of this. Despite the negative connotation, finding God's law comes with need for interpreting the written law. The word law in New Testament, I don't think often refers to God's law, but we definitely can see its reference with sin as being the transgression of God's law. So we've got the written law, derived from the first 5 books of the Bible. We've got the interpreted law, man's attempt at understanding and applying God's law. You've got the civil law, and you've got God's law, the boundaries of sin. And the lines between these different categories can get very fuzzy fast. I tend to think of it like I guess it's called a Venn diagram, where you've got different circles. They can actually intersect, where the written law, the interpreted law, the civil law, God's law, they can all be the same. Do not murder is a prime example of that. And let's go through that example. Do not murder. And how these laws can get fuzzy. Murder is forbidden by the 6th commandment. And there was a penalty associated with it in Israel by stoning. But even murder wasn't always clear-cut. Someone could kill someone accidentally and flee to a city of refuge. When they got to the city of refuge, they stood trial before a judge. And that judge would review the events that had unfolded that led to that death. Was this accident or was this murder? Interpreted law. No doubt there can be tricky cases, especially if the victim was the aggressor in the situation. In the end, a judgment would be rendered. It's civil law. Sometimes the innocent was found guilty, though, and sometimes the guilty go free. What is righteous judgment? That is God's law. So the major point of Paul, one of the major points of Paul, was that the law was insufficient. It was insufficient to cover sin. We need the sacrifice of Jesus Christ for that. And I believe Paul was referring to the written law here when he was making these statements. He was not referring to the interpreted law, civil law, or God's law. Jesus isn't as direct as Paul, but Jesus' teachings also show the law is insufficient, or the written law is insufficient. But in a different way than Paul. The written law, by itself, does not define the boundaries of sin. For example, most Christians regard abortion and pornography to be sin. These are both, I feel, great interpretations of the law. But those weren't issues that they had in Israel, and the written law did not explicitly give you instruction to deal with these things that in their world they didn't deal with. There were definitely things that you could interpret to kind of be used to make a good judgment in these cases, even within the Torah. For example, if a woman and a man kind of got in an argument and the baby died, then that was considered murder. So you could definitely make interpretations. Also, you were told not to uncover a woman's nakedness that wasn't your own spouse's. So again, you could take those cases in the written law and make a good argument that these were sin. These were against God's law. And you can also look at things outside of the written law. Jesus' teachings, the writings, the teachings of the apostle, those are outside the written law, and come to a good conclusion that these are sin against God's law. They're transgressions of God's law. So let's turn to Matthew 19, verse 3. Divorce and remarriage is a controversial subject today, and no doubt it was very controversial in Jesus' time as well. Matthew 19, verse 3. The Pharisees also came to him, testing him, and saying to him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?" And he answered and said to them, "Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away?" He said to them, "Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." So Jesus provides clarity regarding God's law. And he's interpreting the written law. He's not disregarding it. And he is the Son of God. So we can be sure his interpretation is right. His interpretation is right regarding what God's law truly is. And Matthew discusses this same topic earlier in Matthew 5, and we'll actually read this later. But the Pharisees here are testing him. They had probably heard this teaching before, and they were fishing for his reasoning behind taking this position. Because the fact is, the law given by Moses to Israel did not forbid divorce and remarriage. It was allowed, and there were procedures for it. Yet Jesus still called it sin. Jesus' argument is backed by the Torah, the written law, and he quotes Genesis 2. Jesus is clarifying God's law. Many, including the Jews, had different interpretations of the written law. Let's turn to Luke 6, verse 1. Luke 6, verse 1. Sometimes we try to make the law simpler, or God's law simpler than it actually is. And that's kind of what the Jews were trying to do. They were trying to make it simple. You could just follow these steps and everything would be okay. Luke 6, verse 1. Now it happened on the second Sabbath, after the first, that he went through the grain fields, and his disciples plucked the heads of grain and ate them, rubbing them in their hands. And some of the Pharisees said to them, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" But Jesus answering them said, "Have you not even read this, what David did when he was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he went into the house of God, took and ate the showbread, and also gave some to those who were with him, which is not lawful for any but priests to eat. And he said to them, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath." So the Pharisees are questioning why the disciples are doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath. And if you look at the written law, Exodus 34, verse 12, you don't have to turn there. It says, 6 days you shall work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. In plowing time and in harvest you shall rest. So the Pharisees were interpreting this as the disciples plucking these heads of grain. This was harvesting on the Sabbath. Jesus redirects the conversation. And he gives this kind of extreme example. David eating the showbread when he was hungry. And it's clearly not lawful. Jesus says it wasn't lawful. There's no way to slice it. It was unlawful that David ate this bread. But it was yet, at the same time, it was justified. Never does it state that the disciples did something unlawful here. His point is that circumstance matters, and it should be weighed. Sometimes you just have to take a step back and look at the big picture of what is going on. Is plucking heads of grain God's intent by forbidding harvesting on the Sabbath? Which matters more to God? The showbread laws or human life? Circumstance matters. Something that is wrong in one situation may be right in another. Verse 6. Now it happened on another Sabbath also that he entered the synagogue and taught. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. So the scribes and the Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. But he knew their thoughts and said to the man who had the withered hand, "Arise and stand here." And he arose and stood. Then Jesus said to them, "I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to destroy?" And when he had looked around at them all, he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so. And his hand was restored as whole as the other. But they were filled with rage and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. So the scribes and the Pharisees, they had boundaries for everything, and they were well beyond what was stated in the written law. Jesus' healing on the Sabbath filled them with rage. Their focus on the Sabbath was the boundaries that they had created. Healing this man, this miracle, was a good work, and it should have produced joy amongst them. It was God's power in action. But the Pharisees missed the big picture. So in Luke 6, we see here twice that the boundaries of the Pharisees Jesus was challenging. You can't just look at the written law and know the boundaries of God's law. So humans do need to define boundaries. Because we'll read, as we continue reading, God's law goes well beyond what was written in the requirements of the Torah. But we don't just need strict boundaries, we need good boundaries. And we have to ask ourselves certain questions to determine those good boundaries. Is this promoting good or evil? It's an important question to ask with almost anything, including the Sabbath. Another important question we all have to ask is, why does God want me to do this? He gives us laws, he gives us this instruction for reasons. What does God want me to get out of the Sabbath? For me, I believe he wants us to stop. He wants us to focus on him, focus on his goodness, so that we can put on that goodness ourselves in our daily lives, on the Sabbath and outside the Sabbath. The boundaries we form should be consistent with our answers to these questions. In our household, we don't watch TV or play video games on the Sabbath. Unless sometimes if there's biblical content for either a show or even a video game. But in general, they don't watch TV or play video games. This is our boundary to separate and make the Sabbath holy. You won't find a law prohibiting TV or video games in Scripture. Neither are work, but they are distractions that I feel separate us from the purpose of the Sabbath. For both Lindsay and myself, it was a boundary our parents had, and we've continued it with our children. Not every believer is going to have the same boundaries. And sometimes that's wrong, and sometimes that's okay. but it certainly does present challenges. As a teenager, you might think that the hardest part about keeping the Sabbath is missing out on the activities and school events. But for me, it really wasn't. It was pretty black and white to me, and easy to separate myself from that. The hardest part was dealing with other believers, other Sabbath keepers, with different boundaries. Is it okay to listen to music? Is it okay to play a little bit of uncompetitive football? Is it okay to buy orange juice? And it was a challenge for different reasons. It was a challenge because sometimes it was hard to respect other people's boundaries. It just didn't make sense that they weren't okay with that. And sometimes it was a challenge for me because the Sabbath didn't seem holy if we're going to keep it that way. And sometimes it was a challenge just because you thought to yourself, are my boundaries my focus? Am I just like the Pharisees? And it's not always an easy answer. Sometimes you just have to do your best to promote what you know is to be good. Let's turn to John 7, verse 21. John 7, verse 21. Jesus answered and said to them, I do one work, and you all marvel. Moses therefore gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath, so that the law of Moses should not be broken, are you angry with me because I made a man completely well on the Sabbath? Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. So, Jesus is questioning the Pharisees' double standard here. They thought it was totally fine to circumcise on the Sabbath because that law superseded the Sabbath law. But for miracles, which came from God, that wasn't okay. Seems bizarre. They were missing the big picture, for sure. But Jesus ends with this. Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. Not only were their boundaries so strict that they were no longer right, but they were also judging others with this wrong judgment. How are we to judge with righteous judgment? This is another aspect where Jesus differed quite a bit with the Pharisees. Judgment. The Pharisees were constantly judging everybody. They were constantly trying to enforce the law. But this wasn't how Jesus operated. Let's turn to John 8, verse 3. John 8, verse 3. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought him to a woman caught in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be something of which to accuse him, such that be stoned. What do you say? They said, testing him, that they might have something to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger, as though he did not hear. So when they continued asking him, he raised himself up and said to them, He who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Then those who heard it, being convicted by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest even to the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had raised himself up and saw no one but the woman, he said to her, "Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said to her, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." So this whole situation is really entrapment. They were trying to catch him in something, and they had him in this perfect catch-22 situation. Because in Deuteronomy 22, the Israelites were told to stone those who were caught in adultery. But executing someone like that without Roman approval would have been murder, according to Rome, much like it would be today in America. So this is a case where the written law and the civil law differed. There's definitely some shady business going on. It's a setup. There's no guy there. There's a girl there. But the Israelite law said that both were to be stoned if they were caught in the act. We can't be sure what Jesus was writing about, but he wasn't going to make a judgment with all them. He recognized they were trying to catch him. But Jesus flipped the tables on them. He gave no judgment in the presence of the accusers. And he did not do what was prescribed in Deuteronomy 22. This is a precedent to us as Christians. We do not live under the laws of Israel, but America. And the civil laws of America, in fact, affect how we enforce the written law. We are not expected to execute judgments according to the civil laws of Israel. This seems pretty obvious to us with Christ's example, but it wasn't obvious in the first century. Many Jews were still enforcing the written law under Roman rule. And we can see this with all the stonings. We can see this with the stoning of Stephen, stoning of Paul. They tried to stone Jesus several times. Jesus does provide judgment here. He calls out the sin, but he did not punish her. There are not a lot of examples where Jesus was enforcing the law, the written law. He overturned the tables for the money changers. This was a clear demonstration of his disapproval. He had some tongue lashings, but he wasn't bringing down the fire and brimstone. He could have, but he didn't. And in some ways, this represents a divergence from what was laid out in the Torah. Regular citizens were expected to execute the law, and many times it was by stoning. And we can see with the Pharisees that they were hyper-focused on enforcing the law, and Jesus was not. One of his most famous quotes on the Sermon on the Mount is, "Judge not, that you be not judged." And he says this, he says, by what measure you weigh, but you will be weighed. And we can think of this as spiritual guidance. Do not judge, forgive, so that you are forgiven by the Father. But there's a physical application here too. If you're constantly getting other people in trouble, they're going to get you back. You can see that with your kids. Let's turn to Matthew 5, verse 17. Matthew 5, verse 17. This is towards the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. This is really a core aspect of his Sermon on the Mount, this concept of law and how Jesus was laying out what truly God's law was. Matthew 5, verse 17. Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so, shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. So Jesus is making it clear at outset, I am not here to change the law. And which law is he referring to? He says the law or the prophets, which is indicative he's not changing the written law, the Torah. And this whole segment of Scripture is a point of emphasis, and it's a lead-in to the topics that he's going to go on to continue to talk about within the Sermon on the Mount. Because he was anticipating people were going to twist his words. And this wasn't without reason that he might have thought this, because he was bringing a very unique message regarding the law and how we spiritually use that in our hearts. Changing the heart is discussed in the Old Testament, but he is expounding on what all this meant. And he was getting down in the nit and the grit. He was talking about physical adherence versus spiritual adherence. And he was not changing the law. He was changing the focus of the law. And this very much plays into Paul's discussion on the law and faith. So let's continue in verse 21. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Raka, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar, and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Agree with your adversary quickly while you are on the way with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge hand you over to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Assuredly, I say to you, you will by no means get out of there till you have paid the last penny. So here he's dealing with do not murder, the sixth commandment. And this is probably the most widely accepted law amongst all humanity, both among believers and unbelievers. And he's saying this law goes beyond physical restraint. It also has to deal with spiritual restraint internal, that your anger doesn't turn into hate, because hate is sin. And he's saying that you need to address this anger quickly. Make amends before you're giving your gift on the altar. Instead of anger and wrath, make peace. These are internal changes. And these should be defining characteristics of how we work. And this is one way, spiritually, you shall not murder. I'm going to talk about another one as we read on, but we're not going to go there yet. So Jesus is going beyond what is stated here in the written law. Matthew 5, Jesus is emphasizing the spiritual application of these physical laws. And the spiritual application, if they are broken, they are sin. They are transgression against God's law. And the Jews at the time didn't get this. They're sometimes focused on what is labeled the letter of the law, the specifics of exactly what was in the written law. And they didn't look deeply into the intent behind what was written. Verse 27. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. So he's moving one step further from the sixth commandment to the seventh. Do not commit adultery. And in no way is he invalidating either of these commandments. He's actually establishing a more difficult standard. He's establishing the true intent behind those laws, the spiritual intent behind those laws. And here, again, he is focused on restraint. The boundary of God's of the written law, or the boundary of God's law, is not just having sex. Not just not having sex, but the boundary is at our thoughts. Thinking about a non-spouse lustfully. And his means of preventing this sin seems very extreme. To pluck out your eye, to cut off your hand. And this goes back to the conversation on boundaries. This physical removal of the body creates natural boundaries. Each of us may have different boundaries to prevent sin. Even spiritual things like lust, we can place physical limits on ourselves to help prevent sin. And oftentimes these boundaries we kind of place on ourselves, they should be kind of focused on our weaknesses, the things where we know that we have struggled in the past. We may need more boundaries than what's written in the law. If certain types of TV causes lust, pluck those shows out of your life. If you struggle with drinking too much alcohol, just cut it off. Verse 31. Furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. So again, he's dealing with this aspect of do not commit adultery. And this is very much plays into what we read in Matthew 19. We have to ask ourselves, do we treat our wife or our spouse with contempt? Is our love temporary? Or are we giving it our all to build a lasting and loving relationship? This one has less to do with spiritual restraint, but more to do with love. Sometimes the closer you are to a person, the harder it can be to show that love. And I can see this sometimes with my two older children. I call them best friends, worst enemies. Because sometimes they can be best buddies, and sometimes they're just completely opposite and very much at each other. This can happen with spouses too, but with them, it gets toxic fast. Letting yourselves become worst enemies for any amount of time is extremely damaging. If you find yourself having an argument with a spouse, step back and consider, am I showing love? Is this issue really worth the battle? Is it worth having this negative impact on our relationship? Marriage shouldn't be a battle. It's not about who's right. There needs to be respect on both sides. Verse 43, drop down. This goes back to murder. Verse 43, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. So I think this very much plays into the spiritual intent behind the murder commandment again. And like he did with adultery, where he shifted from restraint to this do this part of the commandment, he was stating that it's more than just not hating, but it's loving. Not just loving the people that love you, but loving even your enemies. Many of God's physical laws have both spiritual restraint and a spiritual do this aspect to them. We see this with stealing. Don't covet, but be generous. With lying, don't deceive, but be trustworthy. So let's review what we've covered today. We've got the law and the various boundaries of the law, and the different types of law, or different categories. The written law, the interpreted law, civil law, and God's law. The written law is an excellent tutor as God's law, and Paul actually calls it a tutor. But it is not the only source for the boundaries of sin. The rest of Scripture, the teachings of Jesus Christ, can be used to help us form those boundaries of where sin begins and ends. Even then, we still have to interpret. Even then, we still have to weigh the circumstance, take a step back and see the big picture. We have to create individual boundaries. Pluck out that, cut off that from our lives. Not necessarily, and these boundaries aren't necessarily the boundaries of God's law. These boundaries help us prevent sin from even happening. We talked about judgment. We live in a different world, different civil government than in ancient Israel. And we are not executors of the law in the same sense. We don't stone people. Jesus set a precedent in this matter. Jesus had the authority to judge. He had the authority to rain down fire on evil, but he did not do that. He said, "Judge not, that you be not judged." And he lived his life this way. The Pharisees were irritatingly judgmental. It should not be so with us. The measure we use will be how we will be measured. And this is a principle that holds true in this world as well as the next. And we talked about purpose. God has a purpose behind his written law. He gave us physical laws, and they have physical applications, but they also have spiritual applications. And oftentimes those spiritual applications have a restraint and a to-do aspect to them. Jesus did not come to destroy the law. He says that not one jot nor tittle will pass from it. But there is more to God's law than what is just written. Thou shalt not murder is more than just not killing somebody. But it's not hating, it's loving our enemies. Jesus' teachings make it clear that the intent of God's law is spiritual. He is spiritual and fully intends for us to be in his spiritual family. That is our destiny. His law teaches and guides us towards that destiny.